Welcome back, ghouls and boys. It's me again, Jenny, here to guide you through some more true spooky stories. I hope you all enjoyed last week's tales. I know I did, and I am so stoked to give you some new stories that I think will truly make your hair stand on end. This week, you'll hear about a spirit who just might love shoes more than I do, an Uber driver who had more in mind than just giving someone a ride home, a man whose taste is a bit questionable, and finally, a house in the Heights that wasn't quite empty when the renters moved in. In the last story, The House in the Heights, you're going to hear a few Spanish words that you might not be familiar with. Lechuzas are witches that have shapeshifted into owls, and this is according to Mexican folklore. Also, duendes are small humanoid creatures that live in your home. Think like house elves or gremlins that tend to be mischievous and, depending on who you talk to, may or may not be dangerous. So, let's get cozy. Bring along your Palo Santo this time, trust me, and we'll jump right in. I was 19 years old and was working at a shoe store in the local mall. On this night in particular, I was working with a girl that I had previously worked with. She was semi-new, so we had only worked together maybe 5 times at this point. The shift went well, and we were about to close the store for the night. She took a quick restroom break and returned back, and we began closing duties. While we were working, just the two of us, total silence, we suddenly heard shoes falling. We both went to pick them up and to make sure that nobody managed to stay inside the store, but there was nobody there. So the next day, I was opening and closing the store. I was alone for the first part of the day, and shortly after opening, I saw a woman dressed in all black. She turned to walk down one of the aisles, and I went to go ask her if she needed help. I followed and I turned down the aisle, but she was gone, just into thin air. So around 11 o'clock that day, the same girl from the night before came in to close with me. When my coworker came in, I told her about my experience, and she was like, "Oh my God, do you remember last night when I went to the restroom at closing time? I saw a woman in all black walking behind me." I asked her why she didn't tell me, and she replied, "Well, I didn't want to scare you, especially once the shoes fell." We made it through the day with no other sightings or problems. Nighttime came, and we began our routine of getting ready for closing. We fixed all of the merchandise, shut the gate, and I began closing the register while she did some work in the back stock room. All of a sudden, this really loud static started coming from a radio that we had by the register. But the thing is, the radio was turned off. I looked at the radio, scared and confused, and what I saw was terrifying. The stations were changing back and forth, just rolling through, like someone was just scrolling through the channels real quick. Then I realized I could hear a woman's voice coming from the radio, but with the static. I couldn't understand what she was saying, but I knew they were words. I ran to the back and asked my coworker if she was hearing this, and she said that I was freaking her out and to stop. We rushed through the rest of our duties and closed the store. On our way out of the mall, we ran into a security guard that we sometimes talked to, and we explained what had been happening to us in the store, told him how on edge we were since everything started. He could tell how terrifying this was for the two of us, but told us not to worry, that he would bring us something that was going to help our situation. The next day, the security guard brought us a small Bible and a rosary. We put the Bible by the register and hung the rosary by the restroom. Later that day, after lunchtime, I went to the back room where the rosary was and found it broken into pieces. I asked my coworkers if any of them had touched it, but they all said that nobody else had been back there. I called the security guard and let him know what happened, and he was totally in disbelief. He came to see what happened for himself and was just shocked. He told me that he would bring us another rosary, so in the meantime, we did what we could to repair the first one, and we hung it back up where we had originally put it and finished our day and left with no more problems that night. 2 weeks later, an old woman dressed in all black came by our store and approached my manager. She asked if we wanted for her to say a prayer because there was a bad spirit there. She said she could feel the bad vibes and that she wanted to say a prayer for us. After all the incidents that we had told our manager about, she agreed and accepted the old woman's offer of a prayer. She stood outside of the store and prayed, and then she just walked away. We never saw her again, and we also never had another scary experience while I worked there. I only worked there for another month, but from what I understand, the only other unexplained incidents that continued were shoes being knocked off of shelves at closing, but no more radio static or voices, and definitely no more woman in the black dress. Sorry, this is a bit long. I know this isn't a therapist's office, but this has bothered me for a long time and I wanted to just get it off my chest. This happened in June of 2018 in Portland, Oregon. I understand I acted like an idiot in this situation. Since then, I have become much more observant, cautious, and honestly, more paranoid. I went dancing with friends that night and was really drunk by midnight. Unfortunately, this was back when I had little money, and I realized you could save money by eating very little before going out, and it would take far fewer drinks to get drunk. So, I was so drunk, I barely remember my friend ordering me an Uber home. My phone was dead, of course. I can vaguely recall them helping me into the car and telling me to get home safe. I don't remember greeting the driver or the first minute or so, but soon after getting in, he asked me how my night was and if I smoked. Honestly, I was just thinking about bed at this point, so I sort of just slurred out that I did sometimes. He then offered me a joint, and this is the first moment I get sort of nervous and begin paying attention. I tell him something like, I'm really tired and I just want to get home. I think he said something about it being an indica-based joint and it made for great sleep. Once again, I say something not exactly like no, but not a yes, which he takes as a yes, I'll take that joint now. Once again, I'm still drunk enough I can barely see straight or speak clearly. So when he says, okay, well, I have to cancel the ride real quick because I can't give it to you while I'm on the clock, or something to that effect, it takes me a second to realize how dangerous that is. By the time I start to say something, he's already canceled the ride and pulls over. We were in an area just east of the Hawthorne Bridge, I think, and it was totally secluded. Empty parking lots, a closed auto body shop, no one in sight. It's starting to hit me. I'm now in the car, not with an Uber driver, but with some stranger. I can't call anyone, and he's trying to give me weed that could have anything in it. For the next minute or so, we're pretty quiet. I just can't remember any small talk he tried to make because I was beginning to panic, and every time he handed me the joint, I would take fake hits, just breathing it into my mouth and not into my lungs. I felt tired, clumsy, and weak, that kind of drunk where you're almost at the point of nausea, and I knew I couldn't do much of anything to defend myself at that point. I remember vividly being fixated for a moment on the fact that I didn't even have a pair of keys to defend myself with, as my building uses fobs for just about everything, and I didn't take my mail key with me. As I'm freaking out, I look up to see if this guy is sort of noticing, and I make eye contact with him in the mirror. He was staring at me, but I couldn't read his expression. Finally, he says something along the lines of, well, let's get out of here. I tell him I'll just call another Uber to get home, thinking at this point it might be even safer to walk, and he says, no, I still have your address. I'll just take you home. For a moment, I was relieved. I guess I wanted to believe him so badly that I would get home safe that I believed him. I tried to calm myself down, thinking he hadn't actually done anything threatening. Maybe he was just your typical stoner guy and I'm overreacting. At this time, I lived on PSU campus in downtown Portland in the southwest area of the city. He's driving me north on the east side of the river. There are several bridges to our left, and as he keeps moving north, he has several opportunities to take an exit to hop over the river and get me back downtown. He keeps skipping them. We keep passing bridge after bridge that could get me home. Up in northeast Portland, there are some large industrial areas that can get really isolated at night, and Portland in general is surrounded by lots of forests, so I knew he could have me in a secluded area really quickly. After he passes like the fourth exit for a bridge, pretty sure it was the Broadway Bridge, I've been racking my brain for a way to make him actually take me home and say something to the effect of, "Hey, my boyfriend is waiting for me at home," which was true, though I said it in a very meek way. My driver says nothing, but he did take the next exit for a bridge and basically hung a giant U-turn that started taking me home. Even as we're on the west side of town heading south, I'm still shaking, have my hand on the door handle, thinking about just hopping out at a red light the closer we get to my apartment. My phone is completely dead, and he honestly still has several chances to hop onto nearby highways and speed out of the city. We're getting pretty close to my apartment now, and I'm once again trying to convince myself I'm being paranoid about some stoner that can't navigate the city, although a few minutes before I was so scared I was crying. So once we get about 2 blocks from my apartment, I lie and tell him it's easiest to stop here and he can let me out. Again, he doesn't say anything but does slow down the car. I'm flooded with relief and even feel myself smile, but when I go to open the door, it's locked. I try to lift the lock mechanism manually, but it won't budge. I look at him instinctually to see what's up, and he's got his head turned almost fully towards me, shoulders still facing the road, smiling at me. The worst fucking smile I've ever seen. It looked so mocking, and it just did not reach his eyes at all. I just started crying and asking him to open the door. I was so freaked out and still very drunk, and thank God he did. I will never forget the sensation of vulnerability, not just being drunk in his car with no way to contact anyone, but even as I got out of the car, I kept feeling like he was going to somehow grab the back of my shirt and pull me back in, as silly as that sounds. When I got home, I found out my boyfriend had actually gone out with friends last minute and wasn't even home. He wouldn't have even known till much later that I hadn't gotten back safe. The next day, I convinced myself I was freaking out over nothing, which I realized still could be the case, but in my gut, I had truly felt danger that night. Technically, this guy could have been totally harmless, but I still think I should have texted my friend and had her report him. The big thing that made me think of this was recently hearing about how Ed Kemper, the co-ed killer, would go for practice runs, picking up hitchhikers and seeing if he could get the passengers or potential victims to trust him or see how far out of their comfort zone he could push them without them saying anything. Obviously, this guy wasn't Ed Kemper, but I hate wondering if that night was a practice run of sorts for my Uber driver. There was a time in my life when I was homeless. Can't say that it bothered me as much as it should have. There were certainly some inconveniences involved, such as finding a place to shower, bad weather, keeping clothes clean. Altogether, though, it wasn't so bad. I usually chose to rough it outdoors somewhere when I had to sleep. This night, I chose to post up under a bridge. This is a big no-no in my area, but the weather was bad and we were going to get a storm later in the night. It's not safe under the bridges here. There's lots of freaks and weirdos around. Of all the things I could have overlooked when debating on this decision, it ended up being the fact that the bridges would surely draw others who were seeking shelter. It ended up being only one other person down there, and I was pretty okay with that, as long as he kept his distance. He didn't. As soon as he saw that I was cooking something down there, he came straight over. His clothes were filthy and he reeked of piss, and his hair was matted to his scalp and tangled very badly. He didn't say anything at first, just stood and stared at me. Then he asked if he could have something to eat. I gave him some of my food and he sat down a few feet from me. He brought his portion up to his face and began to sniff it. Not a short little sniff like you'd expect, but several deep, rapid-fire sniffs, almost like you'd expect from a dog. He asked me what was the strangest thing that I'd ever eaten. I told him about the time I killed a mouse and cooked it up to eat it. Most people freak out when I tell them that story, but it didn't seem to faze him. He stared at me the whole time I was talking, shoveling food into his mouth. His eyes were pretty wild, and I was sure he was strung out on something. I asked him the same thing, and he gave me this little manic giggle that disturbed the hell out of me and said it was long pork. I'd never heard this term before, and I did a little head scratching, trying to figure out what part of the pig that would be. I couldn't think of anything right off. Then I came up with the horrible notion that he was talking about the penis, so I asked him if that was it. He giggled again and didn't answer, focusing on eating his food as fast as humanly possible. Then he said, no, it was much better than that, but wasn't for the faint of heart. When he finished his food, he threw the coffee jar lid I'd given it to him on as hard as he could, which pissed me off because I used it frequently enough. It wasn't a big enough deal to bother saying anything, though, so I just let it go. I asked him what it was then, and he said it was people. When he told me that, I laughed, thinking he was probably messing around or just high. That changed when I looked over and saw the way he was looking at me. I don't know how to explain it, except for that he looked like he was going to do something. It was a very predatory look, and it instantly made me uncomfortable. I knew I had to get out of there. As I got up and began to gather my things, he wrapped his arms around his knees and began rocking back and forth and started repeating, I didn't mean to do it. I didn't mean to. Then he looked at me and asked if I was going to tell anybody. I told him no and to just let me get my stuff and go. And he yelled, I don't believe you. I don't believe you. Then looked like he was about to get up. I ran. I left a lot of my stuff behind and just took off. I could hear him running along behind me for a while, then he seemed to give up. I'd never been more terrified in my life. I never went under the bridges again, not after that. I never even went back for my stuff. All I can wonder when I think about it is if he's still out there somewhere, eating his long pork. We've lived in a lot of different houses, as we've always rented. There were things that happened to us at pretty much all the houses that we lived in. We lived in a trailer when I was little where people used to see a little girl walking around. Later, we lived in a house near the Veterans Memorial Cemetery in Houston where there was always a lechuza watching us. We regularly heard the sound of it, which was like a mixture of a duck quacking and a baby crying. My parents wouldn't let us go outside, although my dad always tried to find it. One of my sisters would see red eyes under the bed, and we would sometimes hear whispering from a back room that none of us liked to go into. It definitely seemed like someone had it out for my family. Then we moved into the house in the Heights. It was an old farmhouse that was built in the early 1920s, according to my research, 1924, I believe. It belonged to two brothers whose dad died in the home alone. It had solid doors with those big old-fashioned keyholes in them. The foundation was so bad. There was even a big crack going through the second floor, and the rooms were all slanted. All of the rooms had those ceilings that are low on the sides and would peak in the middle of the room like they were only made for children. One of the rooms upstairs had a small door that led into the attic space, maybe like a crawl space, and it seemed like there must have been a child that would go in there to play because we found old toys in it. I believe that it sat empty for a long time because it was really run down, and the furniture that was in it when my eldest sister moved in ahead of us was from the 1970s. She said that the house looked as though it has been empty for years, and judging by the way everything was set up as far as lighting and things, it seemed like the house didn't even have electricity put in until the 70s or 80s. Closets had no lights, and there was no central AC or heating. There was this weird giant metal fan above the second floor where you could actually see past it and see into the attic, and it was there, I think, to bring in fresh air with all of the windows open. We eventually covered that up since we didn't use it, but it was still really creepy. When my sister first moved in with her husband, they chose the room that ended up being what we thought of as the scariest room. All over the floor of that room were these gashes in the wood that was in sets of 3, like something had 3 claws. and it had been in there and was digging away at it. These were hardwood floors, and we could not imagine what could have made these marks that were everywhere and very deep at the start of the marks, and then they'd get lighter as it went, almost like something was being dragged. We wondered if it could have been furniture, but furniture wouldn't have made claw marks like that. They kept their dogs, 2 small chihuahuas, in the room with them, and one night while they were trying to sleep, the dogs began barking at one side of the room and freaking out. Then they'd switch to looking at the other side and barking up a storm as well. They kept doing that over and over as though they were following someone around the room, barking at them as they moved. My sister and brother-in-law got so scared that they pulled out the Bible that they slept with in their room and began saying Bible verses. Eventually, they turned the lights on and slept that way all night. They were grown adults in their 30s, and it scared them that badly. When we first moved in, we didn't notice much activity, but once I got my dog, we noticed she never wanted to go upstairs. She would only go to the first section of the stairs where there was a little platform, but not up the second section. That was only the beginning. We began hearing footsteps at night on the old creaky floors. The steps were really heavy sounding, like a large man wearing boots. And those footsteps, they always stopped right in front of the room at the top of the stairs. Each of us would hear the footsteps and expect to hear one of the room doors opening, but it never did. It would be steps up the stairs and then stop. If you were downstairs, you could hear footsteps downstairs really loudly. Occasionally, we would hear what sounded like someone moving furniture up there, but no one was even on the second floor at the time, not even the dogs, who wouldn't go unless they were practically dragged to the tub for their baths. When my eldest sister and her husband moved out of the house, one of my other sisters moved into that same room, but she often stayed the night at her boyfriend's house, so she would lock the door so that none of us teenagers could get into her things. When she was gone and the door was locked, we would often hear those heavy footsteps pacing along her bedroom floor. If anyone approached her door, it would stop. Once my sister approached the door and the steps stopped very abruptly, as though whatever it was had been startled. Nobody could have been in there. She had the only key. One day I heard music, and I walked up to her door where it was coming from, and as I approached, I could hear that it was music that sounded like it was from the 1920s or 1930s, and right as I got to the door, it just stopped. One of my aunts visited during the holidays one year and had a vision of black candles lit all down the hall, and around that time, we found a painted-over pentagram as well. In the same area, there was a corn husk cross that had been painted over. Once, my sister and her boyfriend were sitting in one of the bedrooms on the second floor, watching TV together, and suddenly they heard growling from the window. They said it was really deep and loud, and they both came running down the stairs, terrified. On the second floor of such a big house, how could anything have been outside the window? My mom understood, though. Often, when she was in the kitchen doing dishes, she would see a pair of red glowing eyes watching her. Initially, she thought it was my dad messing with her, but since the houses in the Heights were on what looks like stilts, he would have had to have been 9 or 10 feet tall. It also growled at her. We would sometimes see the heavy chandelier suddenly swaying side to side as though someone had pushed it. There were no breezes or drafts, and this thing wasn't light. It would have to have been pushed by hand to move like that. Things would be knocked off of shelves right in front of us. My sister's stereo would turn on its own. Items would go missing and turn up right where we looked. Sometimes we thought that we might have had duendes. My niece once looked through the big open keyhole in the door of the scary room. She was so scared because she saw something looking back at her. She was too young to know the words to explain it completely. There was even a stretch of time when I would wake up every morning at 3 a.m. to the smell of something burning. We had a gas stove and gas heaters, so I would always go around the house to check and see if anything was left on. This happened for a whole month straight, like clockwork, always at 3 a.m. Everything really took a horrifying turn when whatever was there began to mimic our voices. I would hear my mom calling me and run downstairs to answer her, and she would tell me that I was calling her. It would mimic all of us, female voices, male voices. I've heard that when a presence can mimic people, it's a sign that it's evil, and we all heard it. We would all repeatedly answer to someone calling us, only to find that they never did. We all started off scared, but at some point we just got so used to it that it didn't bother us to hear those things anymore. I mean, sometimes it did, but not like in the beginning. We had to learn to live with it. We couldn't just get up and move. It was too good of a deal to find a 4-bedroom house for rent in the Heights for only $600 a month. Eventually, after nearly 12 years, we moved out and the house was torn down. They tried to save it, but it was just too run down. I'm not sure if whatever was there was taken down with it, or if it remains where they replaced it with a $1 million home. I've thought about stopping by sometimes, but I'm afraid that whatever it is still there and might attach itself to me. The thing is, I've had the same nightmare about that place multiple times, and it turns out that some of my family members have too. Thank you again, everyone, for hanging out with me on a Saturday night. We're getting closer to Halloween, so I hope these scary stories put you in this spooky mood, or if you're like me, every other day of your life. Please remember to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss a single episode. And remember, if you like my videos, please give them a thumbs up. Leave me a comment if you have any topics that you'd like to hear about next, or any questions that you have. I always love talking about anything spooky. And don't forget to send me your stories at tftcsub@gmail.com. That's tftcsub@gmail.com. Also, please check out the links in my video description to check out more music by my theme song creators, Such Marvelous Monsters. And also, there's another link for all of your tarot reading needs. Until next week, good night, sleep tight, and don't let your sleep paralysis demons bite.